Hello, my name is Madison McPherson, and in today's PowerPoint, I'm going to be reviewing the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion. So to start off, what is digestion? Digestion is the chemical and mechanical breakdown of food into smaller units that can be taken across the intestinal epithelia. So when we say mechanical breakdown, we're referring to the chewing or mastication that occurs in your mouth before you swallow it. And then when we say chemical breakdown, we're referring to the secretions of the stomach, the gastric juices that mix with the food in order to break it down. And then the absorption, of course, across the epithelia in order to gain the nutrients from the food. So today's PowerPoint focuses on the second phase of digestion, which is the gastric phase. But I'm going to go ahead and touch upon the other two phases, just so you have an idea of where the food is coming from before the gastric phase and then where it goes to once it's over. So the first phase of digestion is the cephalic phase. The cephalic phase is initiated by smell, sight, thought, or even taste of food. So whenever you see or think about food, you stimulate your brain, which then sends a signal to your stomach to start secreting these gastric juices, which I find really interesting that your stomach is already preparing for the food. Before it even gets there, it's secreting the juices in order to break it down. And then we move on to the gastric phase. The gastric phase is initiated when the food reaches and then stretches the stomach. So these stretch receptors in the stomach, which are alerted from the distension of the stomach, they cause a cascade of events. And these events are necessary for the transformation of ingested food into chyme. And chyme is this soupy mixture of uniform particles of food and these gastric juices in your stomach. And chyme is necessary, it's created in order to be pushed along into the intestines. So these stretch receptors are activated whenever the food reaches your stomach, and that, again, stimulates more secretory activity to take place. And then we move on into the intestinal phase. Once the food leaves the stomach, the chyme leaves the stomach, this intestinal phase is initiated when the chyme enters through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum of the small intestine. So I included this little chart. I thought it was really informative on the stimuli and where they're coming from and what they cause to happen with all three phases of digestion. So moving on, I wanted to include a diagram of the stomach. The stomach is where the gastric phase of digestion is taking place, so I thought it was important to show you, here's the esophagus where the food is entering the stomach, here's the upper portion of the stomach, and then onto the lower portion of the stomach. And then you can see how the pyloric sphincter enters into the duodenum. So the stomach has three general functions, the first one being storage. So this is kind of a regulatory mechanism that the body uses in order to maximize the efficiency of digestion. So the food's going to enter and it's going to store it in the top. And then once it's ready, the food will move down into the lower portion where it's digested. And the third function of the stomach is a defense mechanism. So the stomach is secreting mucus along with these gastric acids and juices, and the defense of mucus, it acts as a lubricant in order to protect the epithelia of the stomach. And then also, it helps the defense of the stomach destroys any pathogens that might have been ingested with that food. So that's really important. So over here in this little diagram, you can see that the epithelium of the stomach is simple columnar epithelium. And in this gastric pit, you can see below that is what's called a gastric gland, or the lamina propria. And within those gastric glands are different cell types. You're going to see parietal cells, chief cells, enteroendocrine cells, which we will go over in the next slide. But this is the gastric gland where all these juices are being secreted from. And I just wanted to make a note that in the stomach, where the gastric phase is taking place, this accounts for 2/3 of the secretions of the whole digestion process. I wanted to include this slide. We've been reviewing histology a little bit in lecture, and I thought this gave a really good depiction of the gastric pits right here, and then in the middle where you reach the gastric glands and all the different cell types. So there are multiple secretory cells of the gastric mucosa. I'm going to review all of them, but then I'm going to go into detail on the 3 most important ones. So first we have mucus surface cells, and these secrete mucus. And as I had just mentioned, this is a physical barrier between the lumen and the epithelium in order for protection of the stomach. And then the mucus neck cell secretes bicarbonate. Now, bicarbonate is going to act as a buffer to this gastric acid, and it's going to prevent damage to our own epithelium because gastric acid is a really low pH, which can be damaging to ourselves. So we must secrete bicarbonate in order to buffer that. Also, D cells secrete somatostatin, and this I'm just going to touch on a little bit because we'll go maybe in a little bit more detail in a second. This inhibits gastric secretion, so this is part of the negative feedback loop. Once the food is almost completely digested, this will be signaled, and it will inhibit any more gastric acid to be secreted. So moving on, the 3 primary chemicals that are secreted are acetylcholine. We've talked a lot about this in this past semester, and it's secreted by the parasympathetic nerve fiber of both short and long reflex pathways. And basically, whenever in that lower portion of the stomach, whenever digestion is taking place and those juices are being secreted and the food is being mixed with them, and the acetylcholine causes this muscle contraction called peristalsis to mix that food together and then push it along into the small intestine. And then gastrin. Gastrin is secreted by G cells, and it's stimulated by this acetylcholine as well as peptides and amino acids that are present. And then we have histamine. Histamine is secreted by enterochromaffin-like cells, and this is also stimulated by acetylcholine and gastrin. So this is really important because all 3 of these chemicals cause parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. And going all the way back to slide 1, hydrochloric acid is needed to chemically break down this food, and then the intrinsic factor is used to help absorb all the nutrients that we've just gained. They also, in response to acetylcholine, more mucus is being secreted for defense. And then in response to gastrin, chief cells secrete pepsin or pepsinogen, which digests proteins. And moving on, in our positive feedback loop, once food is broken down into smaller units, such as peptides or amino acids from proteins, G cells are stimulated. And then these secrete more gastrin, which just accelerates the whole digestion process. So this is a positive feedback loop. The more food entering, the more proteins broken down, the more that are sensed, and then G cells are stimulated to secrete gastrin, and then it just is an ongoing process. Well then, once all the food has been digested, and then there are fewer and fewer amounts of these small units, the loop, this is a negative feedback loop, so then therefore this is going to end the gastric phase. And so these smaller units the whole time were acting as a buffer to prevent the pH in the stomach from dropping even lower. So once all the food has been broken down into chyme, the pH is allowed to drop. If it drops less than 2, then the G cells and parietal cells are inhibited, and they are no longer allowed or stimulated to release gastrin. And then with no gastrin, that ends the gastric phase. At the end of the gastric phase, what I've went over before, comes the intestinal phase. So all of this food has entered the stomach, been digested into chyme, and then now it's being pushed on into the duodenum of the small intestine in order to be digested further, to further absorb nutrients, and so on and so forth. Here are my citations. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day. Thank you.